My name is Jim Markey. I'm a retired detective sergeant with the city of Phoenix in Phoenix, Arizona. I supervised the sexual assault unit for 14 years, my last 14 years before retiring. In 2001, we developed a cold case sexual assault team that started working on the backlog of cold cases and sexual assault kits that we had in our organization. So I've been working on this area for about 20 years. Since I retired, I've been a part of several major projects, including the SAFER Act. Right now, we're working as a partner on the SACI, the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative Backlog, which is a BJA grant for jurisdictions to address the untested sexual assault kits that they might have. Well, I really think SARTs are critical for a good response to sexual violence. I can tell you that in 1999, my commander came to me and said, we're going to move into an advocacy center and we're going to work as a multidisciplinary response team for sexual violence. And I just kind of laughed about it, like, well, I'm not going to work with those other people. You know, law enforcement typically is isolated, typically works in a silo. And so he made me write a memo to develop this concept to put us in this advocacy center. And we moved in 1999. It was probably the best thing that ever happened to our organization. All of our resources were there that we needed. We realized at that point that we could not effectively work these types of cases by ourselves in a silo. We needed support. We needed resources. We needed to keep our victims engaged in the system. And law enforcement can only go so far with that type of response. And so I think it's really critical that the partners all know that we kind of rely on each other to help us respond in the best way we can for our community and for the survivors and victims. So SARTs were instituted because what we were seeing and hearing from our survivors and victims was this fragmented response within the criminal justice community and within the community as a whole. It was a lack of communication between the disciplines to effectively provide services and support for the victims. And we realized we all had the same goal, right? We all had the same mission, but we weren't actually moving together as a team in the same direction. And so we realized that, first of all, we couldn't do this task by ourselves, that ultimately for it to be successful, we had to work together to coordinate our response, to coordinate how we did things, to coordinate our resources. It's interesting because I always called it kind of a force multiplier. It's a term in law enforcement that they use where one person can be effective, but a group of people or a team of people can multiply that force exponentially and actually get more things done. When you address issues as a team, people listen more often. People respond to a group saying a certain thing as opposed to an individual talking about something. And I think the perception would be that our system is a well-oiled, smooth-running machine, and this kind of helps survivors and the community build trust back into the system, that we are working together, we are communicating with each other, we are providing support for the victims of sexual violence. It's really all about relationships, whether it's professional relationships at work or personal relationships, and they're hard. There's a lot of things that make relationships successful, and there's a lot of things that are very difficult in relationships. Communication, being able to compromise. For a SART team, having the expertise and knowledge of team members to be able to rely on for information. And I think one of the key things in SART teams and in relationships and building a strong team is trust. Being able to trust the other team members that they have the skill set and the knowledge, that they have the passion and goal that you do, and that they're going to support each other in good times and bad times. Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about the components of a sexual assault team that make it successful. And that comes right back to leadership. Having people in key positions within your team, within your community, that are leaders that know how to bring people together, that know how to compromise, that know how to open discussion and dialogue, to know how to make changes in your community and in practices and responses that we do and that we respond to. So I think building those relationships, having a strong SART team requires leadership, and that leader really has to develop within the team kind of esprit de corps. We're all in this together. We all have a common goal and a mission. We're all moving in the same direction. I always talk about, whenever I discuss with law enforcement, I always talk about everybody's been a part of a team, right? We've been part of successful teams. We've been a part of teams that maybe weren't so successful. So I ask them to stop for a second and think about what made your team successful. Why were you able to accomplish your goals within that team? And usually I'll have some SWAT guys in there and they'll be thinking like, well, we got a team leader. Everybody has an assignment. Everybody trusted each other that they were going to complete their assignment, right? And then we had a plan and we executed that plan under that leadership. And afterwards, when we were successful, we got together and we debriefed about what went good and what were some challenges and gaps that maybe we can address later on, which is very typical of a SART team when you're talking about how they work through issues and challenges as well. I think it's not necessarily the numbers that are in the room. I think it's the quality of people and the commitment of the people that are in the room, that are on your team, working through this issue. One of the big problems with sustaining a SART is turnover. I mean, it's a commitment that we don't get paid for, right? So we have to decide, what are the benefits for me? And law enforcement in particular, I always address, well, what's in it for me? Why should I do this? What are some of the things that I'm going to get out of this to help? And you look at the different disciplines and members that are part of the team that can provide you with support. So maybe if you're working with a survivor or victim and you're their only contact, they're constantly calling you and asking questions and wanting information. You're busy with the investigation or many other investigations as well. So how about other team members like your advocate that can provide kind of that go-between? So you're not spending hours a day on the telephone with questions that perhaps the advocate can provide answers to. And law enforcement's really not equipped for counseling or support or long-term support for sexual assault victims. We're pretty much in it for the investigation, that purpose, and then moving it through the system if we can. But one of the big issues is victims that seem to drop off and drop out of the system. And how do we keep them engaged? In law enforcement, we get frustrated when we do all this work and the next thing we hear is the victim can't move forward, it doesn't have the strength to move forward, stops communication. And I think it's really important that we provide support through the multidisciplinary team that gives that victim that sense of support and strength that they're not doing this alone. There's this team that's going to work with me through this process. And I think SARTs have shown in areas and neighborhoods and communities that victims stay engaged longer in the system and they recover better, for whatever that means, as a result of having this multidisciplinary team there to support them. Really, for me, one of the most important was, and I know this is probably the reason why SARTs get together, is when there's a crisis that's occurring, whether it's in the middle of the night or whether it's an ongoing chronic issue within your community. Having those people on your team that you know, that you trust, that you can email, text, get them together for a meeting, whatever it is, and discuss this issue before it becomes an epidemic, before it becomes a real problem. Crisis in the middle of the night, you know your team members that you can go to and you can trust. You know that they're going to do their assignment, they're going to stay in their lane, and they're going to have the same goal that you have. You know, it's not really that, you know, we have to have this many people at the table, or we got to have this type of discipline at the table. It's really whatever works for your community, whatever fits with how you're functioning within your community in your response to sexual violence. So I never say, okay, you have to have X, Y, and Z in place. I really say, take a look at your community, who your people are. Take a look at who your disciplines are, who the people that are the experienced, skilled, trained folks that have the passion to do this work. Get those folks in the same room, because then they'll probably mesh easier than forcing somebody into a room to say, hey, you're going to meet with us, you're going to meet with us every week, and you're going to be a part of this team. When you bring people in that really are resistant to this, you may win them over, but there are going to be challenges and conflicts that you're going to have to work through. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't like everybody I worked with, right? So that's part of life. But I did understand their position. I did respect them, and they vice versa. So even though on a personal level, I probably wouldn't go out to dinner and hang out with them, on a professional level, we all had the same goals and mission, and we always worked towards those goals and that mission, and that made us successful. I think there's two things to look at in the trust factor. The first trust factor for me is, as a professional on my SART team, do you know what you're talking about? Do you have this experience and the knowledge and the skills to bring to the table good information, to share with us, to train us, to support us? So I need to trust that you know what you're doing. You know your job, you know how to do it, and when you give me information, it's accurate, it's complete, and it's something that I can apply. Then there's a personal trust issue with the relationship, that I'm gonna talk to you and give you information, and it's gonna stay within our multidisciplinary team or our SART team. And I'm not gonna read about it in the newspaper or watch it on television. And that I can trust you that when we share and talk about information, that you're not going to take that information somewhere else and use it to throw me under the bus, for lack of a better term. And I think once that trust gets broken, it's very, very difficult to develop that trust back within individuals and within a team. And it takes time, and that's why it's so difficult with these multidisciplinary teams, is sometimes we don't have members that stay with that team for a length of time where you can deeply develop these relationships and this trust. So you do develop a reputation personally and a reputation as a SART team on whether you can go in there and trust the individuals and the disciplines in that team to provide good, accurate information, to give you support, and to not, lack of a better term, not gossip about what's happening within the community or within the SART team. So it's very difficult. It takes time. It takes communication. It takes building relationships. But I think in the long run, it's worth the effort, even though it is extra effort in a lot of people's long and hard work days. Why this work is important to me. First of all, I've devoted 20 years of my life doing it. It's interesting because it's almost one of those types of discipline or jobs or whatever you want to call it that really gets into your blood. And for me, once it got in my blood in 1998, I just knew this was a place I needed to be. And I knew that I felt like I could accomplish good things for our community in the area of sexual violence. And that's really what drove me. I learned so much as being part of this, the multidisciplinary team, from my advocates, from my prosecutors, from my SANE nurses, from my crime lab. They taught me so many things. I could not have had the depth of knowledge and the skill set that I eventually possessed without them giving me this information. Perfect example, right? We learn more and more over the years about victimization and trauma and offenders. So we were out on a case where a victim had been sexually assaulted at a bus stop, but in this big vacant field. And I was out at the scene, and my detective was with the victim, and I said, "Do you think?" We didn't know where the actual scene was. I said, "Do you think the victim would be willing to come back to this area and show us where this had occurred so we could process it better?" And so he asked her, and he calls me back and says, "Yes, yeah, we'll be coming down there." So they come down, and we meet on the sidewalk where she was initially contacted and assaulted, and then drug into this field. And so, I'm asking, appreciate your assistance. Are you sure you can do this? What we want to do is just so we know exactly where this happened. It's a big lot. We want you to be able to identify this. Do you think you can? And she said she could. So my detective and I start talking to each other and start walking towards the middle of the field. We get about halfway in the field, and I look over, and she's nowhere in sight. And I'm going, what happened to our victim, our survivor? And I turn around, and she's standing on the sidewalk, frozen. She can't move. She thought she could help. She wanted to help us. She thought she could, but she just realized that psychologically and emotionally, she couldn't. She could not go into that field. So luckily, we had our advocates on scene as well. And I said, realizing at that point that we had probably done more damage than good, but our heart was in the right place. We wanted to do a good job for her. And they were able to kind of mitigate the damage that law enforcement had done. So I learned, and that was several years into my work in the sexual assault unit. So I continued to learn and grow, learning from the other team members.